This is Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, and we are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hannah.
Hello, Steve.
And, of course, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph. How are you?
Very good. I'm holding in my hand my latest new book, which I think is probably the most fundamental one I've ever written, called Civic Self-Respect.
And next week, we will be devoting the entire program to a discussion about civic self-respect. That's next week, but today's program will first welcome Washington Post columnist Dana Milbank, who's going to talk to us about his coverage of the destruction that Donald Trump is unleashing on the federal government. He'll have some choice words to say about Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, former Speaker Newt Gingrich, and what the Democratic Party can do to stop or at least slow down the wrecking ball that is the Trump administration. Speaking of which, in his attempt to reshape the global economy, Donald Trump has imposed wide-ranging tariffs that have disrupted international trade and sent the stock market into free fall. It's a developing story that has the entire world on a roller coaster, where he imposes tariffs, pauses tariffs, reimposes tariffs, and then pauses tariffs again. As we've learned from trade expert Lori Wallach, tariffs themselves are not inherently a bad thing as an economic tool. It's how they are applied and to whom that makes the difference. Our next guest is the Dean of Public Interest and Public Service at George Washington Law School and co-founder of Public Citizens Litigation Group, Alan Morrison. We're going to discuss with him whether Trump imposing these tariffs himself is actually legal. According to the Constitution, Congress has the power of the purse. So how is this happening? Professor Morrison will be joining to help us sort this all out and also answer a few other of our constitutional questions. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, who can stop Donald Trump? Is it the Democrats? David?
Dana Milbank is a nationally syndicated op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. He also provides political commentary for various TV outlets and is the author of 5 books on politics, including the New York Times bestseller, The Destructionists, and the national bestseller, Homo Politicus. His latest book is Fools on the Hill, The Hooligans, Saboteurs, Conspiracy Theories, and Dunces Who Burned Down the House. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Dana Milbank.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Welcome back indeed, Dana. Let's start with the article you wrote on April 4th for the Washington Post, actually a column. And readers should know that one of the techniques that Dana uses is aggregation. So like a jackhammer, he takes one factual situation after another and drives it into the ground between his commentary. Your column was called The Economy, the Constitution. Is there anything Trump won't destroy? And the subtext is, the same day Trump said he would chop down Andrew Jackson's Magnolia at the White House, he swung an axe at the Constitution. Give us your narrative here.
Well, you're right. What I try to do each week, Friday morning, is it's sort of my parade of horribles, what all the unbelievable things Trump has done over the previous 7 days. You know, the idea is I'm trying to follow his every move so you don't have to, because there's no reason for us all to get our blood pressure up, or at least not every day. You can just do it on Friday morning when you read the column. But yeah, I mean, I just sort of use the chopping down of the Andrew Jackson Magnolia at the White House as something of a metaphor. So, you know, this is a grand old tree planted nearly 200 years ago by then President Jackson in memory of his wife. And okay, fair enough. It sounds like it's been struggling for many years, and maybe it really does need to be taken down for safety reasons, as Trump said. On the other hand, it was only about 4 weeks earlier when he announced that he wanted to pave the Rose Garden with a stone floor. And obviously you can't have magnolia roots running through there. So maybe it had something to do with him wanting to turn the Rose Garden into a dance floor. And at the same time, he's also planning to make a massive ballroom in the White House modeled after Mar-a-Lago. So you can only think of what Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln would be making of this. But it just struck me as sort of a metaphor for the destruction that he's been doing weekly now, almost daily now, in terms of the Constitution. At that point, he was talking about ways in which he could serve a third term, which is flatly unconstitutional. And then, of course, the tariff rollout, which is just breathtaking. I mean, we all knew he was going to do the tariffs, but still the amount of destruction he is willing to cause the global economy and the domestic economy, it's kind of unfathomable. I mean, no matter how you feel about trade and whether there needs to be some more sensible trade policy than we had, this clearly isn't it. It's brought us back to the Gilded Age. We're back in the 19th century, Ralph, when you were just getting started.
Well, in your column, you say Trump already sent the economy careening toward recession, something that Jamie Dimon of the big bank in New York said was coming. And that's going to involve a lot of unemployment and a lot of disruption for a guy who says he was going to make America more prosperous than ever in its history when he was on the campaign trail. Discuss the layoffs and the selection of the layoffs. You don't see many layoffs in the federal employee world that's handling corporate welfare, handouts, giveaways, bailouts, subsidies. You don't see many layoffs in the Pentagon, the bloated military budget that Trump wants to have careen toward $1 trillion a year, he just said. And you don't see many layoffs of the people who are dealing with the corporate criminal ripoff of Medicare and Medicaid and other government social network support structures.
Yeah,
Give us your take on the destruction of the civil service.
I mean, every now and then you'll hear somebody in the Trump administration, sort of nominally say, yeah, we're going to take on the Pentagon. They're going to have a 10% cut while we're cutting everything else, 50% cut. I'll believe that when I see it. For this week's column, I was talking to Richard White, the Stanford historian of the Gilded Age, and he was talking about just the striking degree to which we are reproducing that time. And it's not just in terms of the tariffs, it's in terms of the robber barons. Elon Musk, the Andrew Carnegie of our day, I guess, having this unparalleled place in the government, a government that has made him rich through subsidies and other breaks and favors. And we seem to be back in that situation where this friendship between government and corporations, it's really, I mean, this is what White was saying, it's something that he never expected to see again, that period of American history repeat itself, because it didn't work out that well for us back in the 19th century. And it's a very different country now as well. But I think we are seeing finally a lot of the billionaires who thought they were going to benefit from the Trump administration saying, okay, now this isn't exactly what I signed up for. And like Bill Ackman and others are clearly having some sense of buyer's remorse as they're losing tens of their billions of dollars.
You've written a lot of articles denouncing Republicans. I always say to you, I wish you wrote some more articles critiquing the feeble Democratic Party, which ushered in the Trump regime. But I'll bet you the Republican performance in Congress has exceeded your own anticipation. Mike Johnson and company especially. Give us your take on that, since you've just written a book on Congress.
I shouldn't be amazed, but Mike Johnson never ceases to amaze me with the rapidity with which he'll just drop to his knees whenever Trump says something. There was a great photo captured of him this week while Trump was celebrating his tariffs in front of this Republican fundraising dinner. And in his lap, Johnson had his phone, and it was a piece from the Drudge Report about economic collapse on the stock markets. So clearly he's worried about this, even as he's listening and applauding Trump. And he's now, in the middle of everything else, they've now snuck in to House rules now, a provision that doesn't even allow them to take up a bill taking back control of tariffs away from Trump anytime over the next 5 months. So he's got Trump's back on the tariffs, just as he had all the constitutional threats. I mean, we've had a series of pretty flagrant violations of various and sundry elements of our Bill of Rights. Johnson, a constitutional lawyer, seems to be fine with that. But then you had a few Republicans joining with Democrats to try to reinstate proxy voting in the House for young new mothers and fathers. But he said, no, that's unconstitutional. Like, that's where he was going to draw the line. He may have hit the end of the road. I mean, we're going to know this shortly, but it does appear that Trump's honeymoon maybe over in the House. The conservatives finally seem to be finding their backbones. But, I've thought that might happen before. And then only to find out that in fact, they could not locate their backbone. So I don't want to be premature.
Well, if the polls start dropping sharply for Trump and 2026 is approaching, the Republicans are going to be saying to themselves, it's our political skin or Trump. And as they did in the Watergate with Nixon, they protected their political skin and told Nixon his time was up. A column I'm referring to that you wrote quotes, once again, this crazy guy, Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, GOP, he called the decisions by the judiciary restraining Trump, quote, a judicial coup d'etat, and suggested that Congress could abolish courts that rule against Trump. How do you make such crazy statements coming out of former speakers of the House?
I don't know. I mean, Newt has been saying crazy things for decades, as you know. So I'd kind of be surprised if he didn't say something like that. But the thing he was criticizing specifically was the notion that you would have district court judges making nationwide injunctions, restraining orders. And that was what he thought was the judicial coup. Now, okay, maybe you can say that's not a policy, that's not something that the court should be doing. However, that's exactly what the courts were doing throughout the Biden administration. There'd be judge shopping to a particular one down in Florida. In Texas, they would issue nationwide injunctions. And there was nary a peep out of Newt Gingrich then. So, I mean, I think he sounds fairly preposterous. Look, Trump has been blocked by federal judges, I mean, more than 50 times now. And I would say that it has less to do with which party appointed the judges. I mean, you just had a Trump-appointed judge slap a restraining order on Trump in his attempt to banish the Associated Press from the pool and from Air Force One. So it's Republican appointed judges as well as Democratic appointed judges. Trump seems to be gambling, and the administration seems to be gambling, that ultimately the Supreme Court is going to just a wholesale reinterpretation of the Constitution to grant these never before seen executive powers. And it's possible that he's right about that. We're not going to know that. There have been a couple of preliminary rulings that seem friendly to Trump, but none of those is final, so we can't really be sure of it. But I think the idea is to purposely violate any number of statutes right now in an attempt to have the whole thing reinterpreted.
My guess is that Chief Justice Roberts is seeing his legacy heading toward the ditch after his decision of Trump versus the U.S., where he said that presidents cannot be criminally prosecuted.
Right, and then having
capacity.
Trump sort of publicly thank him there on the floor of the House when he addressed Congress. Quite embarrassing.
My guess is he's going to unpleasantly surprise Trump in the coming months. But you were a reporter covering the White House years ago. And I want to ask you, Trump is very accessible when he's not playing golf in the White House to the press because he lies all the time. He can be comfortable with these many press engagements and press conferences. But how do you characterize your colleagues, the White House reporters right now, their performance?
It's hard to paint them all with one particular brush. I mean, I think there's some really good reporters, including from the Washington Post, who are on the White House beat. I mean, Trump is taking on not just the White House press corps, but the free press generally in a way that we have not seen, in our lifetimes, maybe earlier times in the Republic, but not during our lifetimes. And, I mentioned earlier the banishment of the Associated Press. They're kicking traditional news organizations out of their places in the briefing room. They're doing the same thing at the Pentagon. It's all kinds of legal threats, whether that's Trump's own lawsuits or having the FCC go after and threaten media companies. You've got this runaway prosecutor, the acting U.S. attorney in Washington, making all kinds of zany actions against the media. So it's really an unprecedented threat. And I'm not sure the press has formulated a response, a cohesive response to it. So, for example, all these sessions you're seeing in the Oval Office, well, the White House is now controlling who gets to go into those sessions. At one of them, we had Russian state media in there. Oh, they claimed that was an accident. And now you're always having Breitbart and One America News and MAGA outlets like that. And so that's why you're getting softball questions in these things. It seems to me like if I could wave a magic wand, I would have the press entirely boycott these sessions and boycott the briefings because they're useless. I mean, it is good to have the president out there on the record. So there has to be some outlet for that, but he certainly seems to be able to afford himself many outlets to do that. And as you point out, it's not exactly like he's conveying useful information in these things. It's some mixture of fabrication and propaganda.
Well, the resistance is building up. The courts so far are restraining him, even though he's finding ways to continue violating him without an open defiance by appeals and circumventions and delays. But the resistance really building up around the country is coming from red states, blue states, conservatives, liberals, because his policies and the poisonous tusks of Elon Musk are attacking everybody. I mean, Hitler reserved privileges for the Aryan white race, but Trump is just attacking everybody. Small businesses being attacked. Wall Street is crumbling. We're seeing the chambers of commerce throw up their hands as projects are not being funded in terms of infrastructure. He keeps promising tax cuts for the wealthy and deregulation, but how smart you think he is in terms of his madness?
It's a fine question because I often when people say, what's Trump's real strategy here and what Machiavellian thing is he attempting, it's often like you're going to come up empty because often it's just whatever is in his gut is in his instinct. And that's why Silicon Valley and Wall Street and a lot of others who had high hopes for him is like, yeah, he's going to deregulate and cut our taxes. And they're like, hold on, we didn't really think he was going to do a trade war. We thought all that was just talking, but it has been. I mean, it's widespread destruction. And in ways that, even if Trump were to right now say, all right, I surrender on the trade war, which of course he's not going to say. He's going to say, I struck a marvelous deal. But even if he does now, I mean, he's driven people away from their confidence in the United States as a trading partner over the long term. He's driving away the Europeans over Ukraine. He's driving Taiwan into the arms of China. He's doing so many things that one could not reverse even if he were attempting to. So stocks will go up and stocks will go down. But now, as it turns out, the bond market can crash too, and the dollar can fall apart as well. But those things can be cyclical. But the loss of alliances and the loss of American leadership, financial and otherwise, in the world is something that probably can't be regained. So he's actually squandering many, many decades worth of work by the United States.
Let's get your take on the Democratic Party. Ken Martin is the new chair of the Democratic National Committee.
With so much ruin being brought by the Trump administration now, it's like, yeah, I understand why people are saying, but the Democrats need to do more. But it's like, there's only so much the Democrats can do. They have no power. I mean, they certainly shouldn't give one vote for anything that Trump is doing. You do have the Democratic attorneys general in the various states filing lawsuits, many with success already. There's no one leader of the Democratic Party. I think that's sort of inherent in being the out of power party. And that's probably not going to change until the Democrats come up with a presidential candidate, which is still a few years off. So I think they're limited in what they can do other than being in lockstep opposition to everything that is coming forward now. They're doing the town halls. They're showing up in Republican districts. You saw the Democratic Campaign Committee this week put out, I guess it's 36 targets for the House elections for next year. Look, I think what really needs to happen is, it's sort of a mirror image of the Tea Party after the 2008 election. It's got to be a grassroots thing. It's got to come from outside of the system. It's not going to be from within Washington. It's not going to be establishment Democrats. The energy is going to have to come from out there in the country, and that will push Democrats and it will push the system generally. Now, you're a fine student of social movements, and we were talking earlier about the Gilded Age, and I think without the corruption and abuses of the Gilded Age, you probably don't wind up with the progressive movement. And I do wonder and hope that because of the rampant corruption and abuses of this administration, that there will be a mass movement to rebuild what he has destroyed and put us back on a sound footing.
I think you're right when you mention the Tea Party alternative. What the Democrats need is a similar level of energy. They could call it the coffee party from back home to really pressure them. The way the Tea Party, the Post estimated that there never were more than 300,000 active Tea Party people around the country. And look at the impact they had on the Republican Party. David?
You say the Republicans are finding their backbone. But, they found it after January 6th, or at least some of them, like Lindsey Graham found it. And then weeks later, they lost it. In your book, you write about the threats of violence surrounding Jim Jordan's race for Speaker in 2023. Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, was prepared to vote against Pete Hegseth for defense secretary. That would have killed the nomination. There are reports that Tillis voted for Hegseth because of the death threats. Given Trump's pardons and commutations for the January 6ers, how much does the threat of violence play into all of this?
Threat of violence is always there. I think probably Tillis was more concerned about less the threats to his life than the threats to his reelection because he's in cycle now. So yes, it is the threat of political violence is ever present right now. I think, greater than it's been in some time, not in all time. But I do think and you're quite right that backbones are occasionally found and then misplaced again moments later. And what's really going to have them stand up to Trump, it's not really going to be a matter of backbone, but a matter of self-interest. And that is if Trump's poll numbers tank, if the economy is in recession, and obviously we're seeing pretty substantial move towards both of those things, then their self-preservation will kick in. I mean, their rallying around Trump isn't because they actually love the man. It's because he has an iron grip over the Republican Party. And in the vast majority of cases of members of Congress, the only way they're going to lose their seat is if they're voted out by a MAGA candidate in a primary. They're virtually all, except for a few dozen, are in the House or from safe districts.
Well, it's more than threats to physical violence. The students have been kidnapped on residential streets by ICE agents in plain clothes with masks and hurled into Louisiana prisons. And it's also the seizure of even legal immigrants, not just immigrants without papers, by ICE agents, manhandling these people without proper legal notice. And then to top it all, Trump just made a statement saying he's thinking about deporting U.S. citizens. So it's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of the deportations, we've seen large numbers of people sent off to Venezuela without any due process whatsoever. Supreme Court, less, is allowing this sort of thing to continue, which is disturbing. I think there have been 7 cases of U.S. citizens mistakenly rounded up, either detained or deported. As you made reference to, I think there have been a couple of hundred students on student visas rounded up and deported. This is full of abuse and it's really quite widespread. And the lower courts have been pretty forceful in pushing back against this, particularly with the Supreme Court keeping the door open to it. This is just going to go on.
Any things that we didn't discuss that you want to point out?
You covered it all, my good sir.
All right. Well, we've been speaking with Dana Milbank, longtime columnist and formerly White House reporter for the Washington Post, and a growing triumphant advocate for returning back to the land and tasting the benefits of the natural world. Thank you very much, Dana.
Ralph, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. You are a national treasure.
We've been speaking with Dana Milbank. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, what Donald Trump is doing with tariff appears to be dumb and bad, but is it also illegal? But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 11, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Over the past month, President Trump has been pardoning white-collar criminals. But in what may be a first, President Trump last week pardoned a corporate criminal. Earlier this year, BitMEX was fined $100 million for violating the Bank Secrecy Act by willfully failing to establish, implement, and maintain an adequate anti-money laundering and know your customer program. There have been plenty of cases where presidents have remitted fines or forfeitures or something else like that, said Margaret Love, who served as a U.S. pardon attorney from 1990 to 1997. As far as I know, the president has never granted a full pardon to a corporation. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest is going to help us sort out the legality of all this tariff business. David?
Alan Morrison is the Lerner Family Associate Dean for Public Interest and Public Service at George Washington Law School. He currently teaches civil procedure and constitutional law and previously taught at Harvard, NYU, Stanford, Hawaii, and American University law schools. He has argued 20 cases before the Supreme Court and co-founded the Public Citizen Litigation Group in 1972, which he directed for more than 25 years. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Alan Morrison.
Thank you, David. My pleasure to be here.
More than welcome, Alan. The news is dominated these days by Trump tariffs in all directions, weaving and bobbing and all kinds of instability. And a lot of people are confused about the economic impact of these tariffs because he promises paradise and economists are promising increased prices and instability and recession. But you have challenged the authority of the presidency to impose tariffs and think that it should reside in Congress. Give us an educational lesson, Alan, in what the status constitutionally is historically of who can authorize tariffs.
Well, Ralph, thanks very much for the introduction. It's so nice to be here and be able to talk with you. Tariffs are a form of tax. If you, the consumer, think about when you go to the store and you live in a jurisdiction that has a sales tax, that sales tax gets added on top of the price you pay for the product. Well, that's essentially what a tariff is. But the tariff is added at the time that the product enters the United States. It's paid initially by the importer, who then sells the product to a wholesaler maybe, or to a retailer, or sells it to a manufacturer as a component of a product that's going to be a finished product, like an automobile, for example. Importers, being smart folks that they are, do not absorb the tariff themselves, the tax, just like the retailer at your local store doesn't pay the sales tax when you buy something from that retailer. The retailer is obligated to collect it, and then they pass it on. So here, the tariffs are going to be passed on. Now, maybe some portion of a tariff will be absorbed in the interest of selling more goods by the importer or by the retailer or by the wholesaler or by somebody else along the line. But it's inevitable that even for a non-economist like myself to understand that these are going to be passed on. Other than Donald Trump, I don't think there's anybody who believes that these taxes are not going to be passed on and that they're going to be borne by the country from which the company did the exporting. So that's step number one, their taxes. Second is, under our federal constitution, the authority to impose taxes and tariffs has historically and textually always been assigned to the legislative branch. Donald Trump doesn't quite reject that notion, but he says that the legislation that have been enacted are extremely broad and allows him to do many, many things that it's doubtful that the original legislation intended him to do. So let's take the principal law that he is using to impose these massive tariffs. And it's called IEEPA, which stands for, if I get it right, International Emergency Economic Policy Act. And it's a law that allows the president to invoke a national emergency in times of national emergency. And so the first question that might be asked is this a national emergency? Trump proclaims that this is a national emergency, but he also says at the same time, it's a problem that's been going on for 50 or 100 years. That doesn't look in the face of it like what Congress thought about when they talked about national emergencies. The difficulty in challenging that in court is that the courts have traditionally given the president wide leeway in his definition of national emergency. But that doesn't end the problem for Trump there. The big problem is that the statute is designed principally to deal with other situations, not dealing with tariffs. Indeed, the word tariff and tax is not mentioned any place in IEEPA at all. It's principally dealing with the problem of foreign currencies or foreign materials coming into the United States, which are dangerous in themselves or which are financial instruments. Nothing to do with tariffs. So let me stop at that point, Ralph, and see if you have any questions about that part of the argument.
It's an extension. You actually argued this in New York City before a federal court, representing a number of clients who had legal standing because they could be damaged by these tariffs. Tell us about that.
So that was an earlier case under the Trump administration. It was under Section 232 of the Trade Act, which allows the president to impose tariffs when the importation of the product may cause harm to the national security. And the president said that the importation of steel products would harm the national security. There was no question under the statute that he was using the right tool to get at it. What our argument there is that there were no limits whatsoever on what the president could do. That is, unlike other tariff statutes that said you could only raise the tariff by 50% or the amount equal to the harm caused by the other country, there were no dollar limits whatsoever. Second, we argued that there were no time limits on it. The president could keep these tariffs in place for as long as he wanted. Third, he could treat different countries differently. For example, he got mad at Turkey for something it did having nothing to do with steel or tariffs, and he doubled the tariff in the middle of this process against Turkey from 25 to 50%. And that was another example of what the president could do without any limitations whatsoever. And third, the president set up a system of exemptions from tariffs, which meant that depending on who you were and whether you had favor with the current administration, you could get an exemption from the import tariffs on steel and aluminum.
And Apple imports from China.
Oh, yes. Well, this earlier case, Ralph, just had to do with the steel tariffs. This was back in 2018 and 19. And we made the argument that this was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. By the way, we will also make this argument in the current round of tariffs that under IEEPA, because the delegation is even broader there than it is under Trump's earlier tariffs. We made this argument and we ended up losing, not because we didn't convince the judges in the Court of International Trade in New York that they were extremely broad, but the court there felt that it was constrained by a prior decision involving an earlier case from the 1970s that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court there rejected the claim of delegation in a very different set of circumstances than we had here. And both the initial court and the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit said that they were bound by the earlier court. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court refused to hear our case back then. So it's an uphill battle on both the statutory interpretation and the undue delegation grounds. But our position is rather simple. If the Congress doesn't write a statute so that there's something that the government can't order or do, then it's gone too far. In effect, it has surrendered to the president its power to set policy and do the legislative function. Interestingly, Trump has trumpeted the breadth of what he's doing here. He calls it a revolution. Well, if we have revolutions in this country, my copy of the Constitution says that the Congress has to enact revolutions and the president can't do it on its own. So we think we've got a pretty strong case if we can get it to court. But as you may notice, Ralph, there are a lot of people that are very much afraid of what Donald Trump will do to them in retaliation. And they are very reluctant to sue the president because he's so vindictive and has been willing to retaliate against so many people already.
Alan, in recent days, there have been stirrings in Congress among some Republicans and Democrats, most vocally Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, about putting some reins on Trump's unbridled discretion to impose tariffs. Can you tell us about what they're thinking?
Well, I don't know what they're thinking, Ralph, but I know that the only way they can take meaningful action is to pass a law. And if they have to pass a law, Donald Trump will veto it. And so unless they're prepared to try to impeach him, which I don't think they're going to try to do, certainly they have to start that in the very, very Republican and non-dissenting House of Representatives. There's not much they can do. They can threaten to withhold money, but that's probably not going to work. They can refuse to confirm some of his ambassadors and department heads, not likely to persuade Trump. So, it's good that they are bringing this to the fore and maybe they can extract some changes. But Trump seems quite dug in on this issue. And I think that stirrings in Congress are not likely to change his views at all.
He's also dug in on spending or not spending monies appropriated by Congress, violating the Impoundment Act. Tell us about that.
Well, Ralph, you certainly remember when I first came to work for you back in 1972, I had this little list of things I wanted to do. And number one on my list was the impoundments that Richard Nixon was then doing. And you gave me the green light to go in and litigate this issue, and litigate it we did, along with some other people as well. And Supreme Court ruled that Nixon didn't have the authority back then to impound. In the meantime, Congress had its backbone up. And I remember that you and I testified before Senator Ervin's committee on the separation of powers in the Senate Judiciary Committee about the Impoundment Control Act. And we strongly supported the act, and it was eventually enacted in 1974 and is still good law today. We can talk about it in a minute, but this was an important case where Congress stood up and said, we want to remove all doubts that the president can simply refuse to spend money that he thinks is being misspent, any kind of reason, whether it's a policy reason, waste, fraud, and abuse. He thinks the idea behind it is bad. None of those reasons will matter. The president cannot refuse to spend money that Congress has appropriated unless he gets Congress's approval.
And how's it turning out right now, day after day?
Well, first place is the Congress wrote this law was smart enough not to be stuck in the position of catching a president from withholding money. And so it requires the president, when the president wants to refuse to spend money, as Trump is plainly doing here, to send the Congress a message saying, Congress, I want you to rescind the particular appropriations. And number one, I have to tell you which ones I want rescinded. Number two, I have to tell you how much it's going to cost. Number three, I have to give you some reasons why you should rescind it, change the circumstances or whatever the reasons. And that report has to go right after the president decides he doesn't want to spend the money. The key thing about this is it's up to the Congress to approve the president, not the Congress to disapprove the president. So after 45 calendar days, and that's actually a few more days because it doesn't count days when Congress is in recess, the president must spend the money unless Congress passes a new law that says, Mr. President, you do not have to spend the money. In other words, the permission goes from Congress to the president, not from the president to Congress. President Trump has completely disregarded this. He is blatantly refusing to spend money. He's cutting back on programs all across the board and has not even sent the message to Congress, let alone has gotten Congress's permission to do so.
Give some examples of how it's harming real people here and abroad, like the cutting of spending of the AID budget and other domestic budgets.
So domestic budgets, they're cutting out all sorts of research and development money for NIH, for the Veterans Administration, for HHS, for the Centers for Disease Control. It is cutting back the number of personnel at Social Security Administration. It's not cutting back on the monthly payments that people receive. But if you have a problem with Social Security, you want to be able to pick up the phone and get a phone answered. You can't get the phone answered if there aren't people there. They're shutting down places for people to go. They say, do it on a computer. Well, that's fine for people who use computers, but many people don't. The phone lines are not operating. That is just the same as if they're cutting people's benefits. Everybody who's already on benefits, as long as they don't have any problems, will continue to get their money. But if they have a problem and they need to get it straightened out, they can't get it straightened out. If you want to apply for new benefits,
IRS? Talk about IRS.
Well, there's two things with IRS. Number one, for the ordinary taxpayer, for whom the Internal Revenue Service is very complicated, code is complicated, they have questions. Congress has mandated that the IRS spend money so people can get their questions answered so they can file their taxes properly, pay the money they owe, and not pay the money they don't owe. This is coming to a crashing halt in the next couple of weeks with the cutbacks at the IRS. Second, equally important, from the perspective of all those who pay our taxes, we want to be sure that everybody else pays their taxes. What's Trump doing? He's cut back on all the enforcement, cutting back on audits. That means that the wealthiest among us, unless they're terribly honest, are going to not pay as much taxes as they owe. And that affects all of us because we create a bigger budget deficit. Other programs can't be spent, and the taxes may have to be raised on those who do not have loopholes. Those who their income is entirely wages or maybe a little bit of interest income from their banks. They don't need to be audited because they're self-audited because all the income is reported to the Internal Revenue Service. And then, aid for foreign overseas, millions of people could be ill or die because the medicines and the products that we send overseas to protect them are not going to be there. The president talks about these money going to foreign aid as if we were writing checks to these other countries so they could do whatever they want. No, most of what we send over there is American products, medicines, military supplies. These are part of foreign aid. But among other people being injured by these are the U.S. manufacturers of products that are not being bought by the government and then sent overseas. So you can look any place, Ralph, and you will see massive impacts of the impoundments that the president is illegally using to advance his policy interests, but not those that Congress has enacted.
So you see, listeners, the connection between a sort of esoteric legal discussion we just had about the Impoundment Act comes back violently against the health, safety, and economic well-being of millions of innocent people. Alan, you wrote a really special article for the Hill newspaper about the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is an arm of Congress, being missing in action when we need it the most. I've always admired the GAO. It's one of the jewels of creative oversight by Congress. It had about 5,000 accountants over the years, and they produce reports analyzing the effectiveness and the efficiency of government departments and agencies. In the era of the Musketeers, all you hear is about this phony project. If it isn't phony, it's cruel, by Trump and Musk to weed out inefficiency waste in the federal government. And you're saying, where is the GAO on this, which of course is controlled by members of Congress? Can you elaborate?
Sure, Ralph. The GAO has general responsibilities to see that fraud, waste, and abuse and other inefficiencies are eliminated. But it has, under the Impoundment Control Act, a special responsibility for impoundments. It first is supposed to receive copies of the messages that the president sends over about impoundments and review them and inform Congress as to what its recommendation is as to whether the rescission should be allowed. But second, it has an independent obligation to investigate impoundments that it learns about. And if the president is not complying with the law, to notify the president and eventually to bring lawsuits to ensure that the president does what he's supposed to do. At the very least, the Comptroller General, who's head of the General Government Accountability Office, ought to be sending letters to the president, making them public, demonstrating that the president is not complying with the law. And so far, we've heard nothing from them. I suppose it's theoretically possible that they're working in the back offices someplace and doing something, but it seems highly unlikely, because the goal of the GAO in this particular function is to see that the president complies with the law. The first and easiest way to do that is to publicize the fact that he's not complying with the law, so that members of Congress have no place to hide themselves. As you pointed out, Ralph, of course, the GAO is controlled by Congress, but the head of the office is pretty independent, and the current incumbent has only about 8 or 9 months left on his term. He's not worried about getting fired. Only Congress can get rid of him, but I don't think he's worried about that. And if he is, it's a wrong kind of worry. He ought to be thinking about his legacy to the public. Did he step in at this time of crucial need for the Impoundment Control Act to be enforced and do whatever he can possibly do? Now, he may not have the ultimate ability to stop the president, but he surely can do a lot more than he's doing right now.
Well, the Comptroller General, his name is Gene Dorado. We've had him on the program. He was remarkably open about things. Could there be another explanation where the GAO takes a long time to conduct these thorough investigations, and they have them underway, but, time is passing them by?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's possible, Ralph, but, if you are really interested in enforcing the laws, as the GAO should be, you ought to at least tell the public that you're doing it and try to speed up the investigation. There's nothing to investigate, really, Ralph, on the failure to send these reports to Congress. That's an open matter. Either they're sent or they're not sent. And you don't have to have a whole team of people spending months to figure that out. It may be complicated as to what you should do eventually and can do eventually about it, but at least making it clear that in the eyes of the Comptroller General, the president is not complying with the law. That's the least that can be done.
I think you're absolutely right on that point. The GAO has lawyers as well as economists, and they have filed suit in the past. And he's been a pretty good Comptroller General. Did he react to your column at all, or did you ask him to react?
Ralph, you know what happens when people write letters to the government. You've written quite a few and got no answer.
Let's go to Steve.
Hi, Alan. I wanted to, if you don't mind, change the subject here. You've argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. If you were, say, defending Columbia University, and Columbia University was willing to stand up to Trump over freezing their federal funding, what would your argument be on behalf of Columbia University?
Well, I'd have a bunch of them. The first thing I'd want to know is what statute gives the president authority to cut off funding? Second, what specific acts have Columbia done that justify it? Third, when do I get a hearing, an opportunity to present my side of the case, basic due process elements? And when do I get to go to court? Surely that should be before you cut off my funding. And then the last thing I would say is, what about the First Amendment? The government can do things. They can cut you off for certain reasons, but they can't cut you off for reasons that are based on your political views. Even assuming for the moment that Columbia didn't fully do everything it could to tamper down anti-Semitism, and on that I have no views about this, and recognizing that no university can control every person who works for them, or let alone every student who raises an objection or conducts a demonstration. At some point, the university's got to be responsible. But the question is, the general charge, you're not doing enough to prevent anti-Semitism, is not a sufficient charge. They would have to be specific and show typically a pattern and practice of refusing to respond to complaints about unreasonable demonstrations on the campus and failure to take into account the legitimate interests of other students and other members of the Columbia community. So I'd want to know quite specifically what it is, and does it rise to the level of you being able to take away $400 million worth of spending for the government? I mean, presumably that money is being spent not to enrich the trustees or the faculty at Columbia. It's being spent for important government purposes. And those clearly have to be taken into account, that this punishment is not directed at the board of directors, a board of trustees of Columbia. It's directed at the beneficiaries of the programs that it was supposed to attend. He seems to have taken nothing of that into account. I haven't seen the actual letters or haven't examined the statutes, but those are some of the things that I would be looking at if I were advising Columbia about it.
Hasn't the court already ruled that trying to condition the way Trump is conditioning suppression of free speech and pro bono for his causes with suspending $400 million in grants and contracts illegal, a form of extortion?
Well, I agree, Ralph. It is a form of extortion. I don't know that they've ruled this in the specific facts of the case. That is to say, giving the president some benefit of some doubt that there may be some things which he has a basis for being concerned about at Columbia. The question is, do they rise to the level of him being entitled to cut off the funds? Indeed, it's not even clear that under the law, he is the person who's entitled to cut off the funds. Typically, the president, that's not a job for the president, and some other responsible officer has to sign off on it. Now, maybe he would get somebody, whoever it is, to sign off on whatever he wanted to write. But, there are people in the government who will say no, who say this is too unreasonable. He just threatens it himself. And many of the universities so far have been unwilling to stand up.
David?
Russell Vought, Trump's budget director, testified during his confirmation hearings that he believes the president has the power to impound congressionally allocated funds. He's confirmed. As you said, the law is clear here. So what's the difference between impoundment and a line item veto? Congress, I believe, once gave the line item veto to the president. Clinton, the Supreme Court said the line item veto was unconstitutional. If you were Trump's Solicitor General, how would you argue on behalf of Russell Vought? What is the argument they're going to make when the law is so clear here?
I agree with you 100%, David, that there is no argument in favor of the unconstitutionality. The Line Item Veto Act, Congress attempted to give the president the authority to refuse to spend money that he didn't want spent, and against the wishes of Congress, which put the money in the bill to begin with. Even where the Congress agreed to give the president that power, the Supreme Court said you can't give him that power. How in the world can Russell Vought claim that when Congress has denied the president that power in the Impoundment Control Act, it's somehow better than when the Congress has given him that power and the Supreme Court said no? It's completely backwards. And so in some work I'm doing with some members of Congress, we're going to present those arguments as well as the other arguments in briefs that we're going to be filing in cases in which the impoundment issue is squarely raised. Unfortunately, not all these cases are raising that issue. And in some, there's some complications because the claims are more about workers who do not have the best impoundment claims. But there are better impoundment claims in other cases. And we're hoping that those cases will get up to the court and the court will say no. And then we'll see what happens.
And Alan Morrison, who brought the line item veto case and won in the Supreme Court?
Well, Ralph, I confess to you that I brought the first case, but we had written a statute that gave members of Congress who actually lost tremendous power under the Line Item Veto Act the authority to sue, and the Supreme Court said they didn't have standing. So the second case that actually went up was decided. Somebody else argued that case, but I filed a brief in support. But I had won the first case in the lower court, and the arguments remained the same throughout. So I guess I can take a bunch of credit for it, but not all of it.
Wow. When I asked that question, I had no idea. Wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's good for our historical record, David. Hannah?
With things like the tariffs and impoundment, it seems like Trump is looking at everything he can, and he wants to be the one to press the big red button. And there are certain powers that we accept that the president should be allowed to press the big red button on. And Trump seems to just decide everything in the country should be a big red button I can push. What are the things that we've allowed the president to kind of take exclusive control over that maybe we might want to reconsider?
Well, one is the pardon power. It's expressly provided in the Constitution that the president can pardon whoever he wants. Trump was concerned that Biden had pardoned his family. I think most people were much more concerned that Trump had pardoned 1,500 convicted felons, misdemeanors, for their role in January 6th. Can you imagine being federal judges here in Washington, D.C., having spent 4 years trying criminal cases and convicting and sentencing the guilty, and then Trump coming in and saying, never mind, it's all out the window? Maybe the president should have the pardon power, and I don't know any way that we'd have to amend the Constitution, and even then I wouldn't know quite what to say you could pardon people who deserve it, but not people who don't deserve it. That's the problem. And Hannah, one of the things that I've been struck by is that laws alone cannot make this country governable. That we can't write laws to cover every situation and every quirk that any person has, especially the president. We depend on the norms of government, that people will do things not exactly the way everybody did them before, but along the same general lines. And that when we make change, we make them in moderation, because that's what the people expect. Trump has shed all norms. He shed them in the first administration, too. We have conflicts of interest rules, statutes, that's supposed to deal with people who divest of their interest in the matters that they are controlling while they're in the federal office. Trump had investments all over the country and all over the world that in anybody else, we would have said, that can't be right. You're the Secretary of State. You can't have investments in all these countries you're negotiating with. But the laws didn't deal with a person of the wealth and extension of power that he had in the United States and abroad. And the way that he brought his family into the White House ended up arrangements so that Jared Kushner would get billions of dollars from the Saudi Arabians because he's the son-in-law of the then former and now once again president of the United States, and reaping millions and billions, perhaps billions of dollars a year in fees for running these wealth funds for the Saudi Arabia. Got that because his father-in-law was the president of the United States. We don't know how to deal with those kind of situations because they're norms that we all expect people to follow. But if you don't follow the norms, we can't get laws enacted fast enough to catch up with them. And if we did, we'd have a country that was ruled by strict following of the laws, and the freedom that so many of us are endeared to would be a very different country if we had that. So this is a terrible problem that we have in the government right now, that all the norms have been shattered, and that you don't fire people who work for the federal government just because you think you can. You know, Ralph, many people went to work for the federal government for lots of good reasons. The work is interesting. They're doing good. They want to be part of the solution and not the problem. But part of the trade-off was maybe they got a little less money, but they had a job that they felt secure in as long as they did what they were supposed to do. All that is gone. And it's not just gone for the people who lost their jobs in the government, but it's gone for my students who say, you know, I don't know that I can go to work for the federal government, sacrifice for 10 years or so, and then find my job is taken out from under me because some crazy person comes into the White House. and decides that they want to eliminate all these jobs for some reason that nobody else has approved of. That's a big norm shatterer. And I don't know how we're going to be able to, as a country, recover to the point where we can get back and say, these are things that we're doing and they may not be perfect, but let's kind of slow down on the pace of change.
On that note, we have to conclude, listeners. We've been speaking with Alan Morrison, longtime Associate Dean, Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School. And for many years, he headed our Public Citizen Litigation Group and won a lot of cases at the district court level and at the Supreme Court level. Thank you very much, Alan Morrison.
Thank you, Ralph, for inviting me, and thank you for being my mentor and person who made my time at Public Citizen possible.
Well, you're very, very welcome.
We've been speaking with Alan Morrison. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Last week, Ralph asked if we should devote an entire show to your listener questions, and the response was tremendous, so that's what we're going to do. But now we need the questions. So send your questions to ralphnaderradiohour@gmail.com. Make them short and sweet, please. No essays, no long op-eds. Just make them questions. And when we get enough good questions to fill the show, we'll do it. Thank you. I want to thank our guests again, Dana Milbank and Alan Morrison. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question in this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we discuss Ralph's new book, Civic Self-Respect. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. An invigorating discussion is heading our way next week. I can guarantee you, listeners.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you